Hi everyone, my name is Naeem Kalwar and I'm Extension Soil Health Specialist out of the NDSU Langdon Research Extension Center. Like everything else, extreme changes in weather affect not only soil health but agriculture in general. Wet weather brings its own set of unique challenges, whereas extreme dry weather is not good for soil health either. Before I would like to talk about the challenges which wet and dry weather bring for soil health. I would like to share some long-term annual data with you. So this is end-on data. And what we have here is actual rainfall numbers versus the potential evapotranspiration numbers recorded from April 1st to October 31 on an annual basis. I actually wanted to present the data starting from 1993 because that's the year when the recent wet weather cycle actually started, but there was not enough space on this slide. And I also wanted to pick some weather stations which are close to Devil's Lake, such as Edmore and Webster. But these stations have not been around for a long time, so I also included some weather data from Langdon just to have a look at the long-term weather from a long-term perspective. Edmore stations has been recording the annual rainfall and potential evapotranspiration numbers from 2018, whereas Webster started measuring these numbers from 2019. The point I want to make by showing you this data, that if you look at the from year 2000 2001, say the Langdon data, there were some years when Langdon station didn't really record a lot of rain. For example, 2003, 11.36, which is very similar to, say, 2020 and 2018. And we consider that below normal, because normal for that weather station is 16.68 inches. But even during the year when Langdon station recorded quite a bit of rain, for example, 2010, 22.6 inches, 2016, when Langdon weather actually broke the 100-year-old record for the overall precipitation, despite recording 25 inches of actual rain, and Don station also recorded a little bit over 40 inches of potential evapotranspiration. So weather, even during the wet year, is on a semi-arid site, so it's on a drier site. We don't have the rain which equals the potential evapotranspiration. We get less rain than that. And also I want to point out that just by looking at the total actual rain numbers could be deceiving. For example, in 2021, Langdon shows that it got very close to the normal rainfall, 16.66 inches or 16.68 inches of normal rainfall. Whereas we know that how dry the early part of the growing season was. So just by looking at these total numbers, we cannot really get much out of these numbers. So what I did is I separated from each station, I separated the actual rainfall and potential evapotranspiration numbers into two different periods of time. For example, Edmore, from April 1 to August 19, it was very dry, 5.01 inches of rain, versus a normal of 11.85 and a potential evapotranspiration of 34.85. So Edmore Station didn't even get 50% of the normal rainfall during the early part of the growing season. But in the later part, from August 20 to October 31st, it actually got close to 9 inches of rainfall, which was very close to the potential evapotranspiration, and it was twice as much as the normal rainfall for that station or the area. Same story was for Langdon, April 1st to August 8th. Langdon Station recorded 6.44 inches of rainfall, which was slightly over 50% of the normal, with over 30 inches of potential evapotranspiration. But on August 9th, Langdon Station recorded 3.68 inches of actual rainfall in 10 to 12 hours. And after that, we just kept getting decent showers. So you could see we got a little bit over 10 inches of rainfall. So we're looking at close to 200% versus the normal, with potential evapotranspiration of 12.16 inches. And same was the story for Webster. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if somebody who didn't live through this growing season and they're just looking at the overall numbers, they will not be able to understand when we talk about how dry the early part of the growing season was in 2021. So you have to look everything in perspective. So if we look at now the effects of wet and dry weather on soil health, we looked at the actual rainfall numbers versus the potential evapotranspiration, and even during the wettest years, our potential evapotranspiration was more than the actual rain. That means we were on a drier side, semi-arid side. But say in a year like 2016, when we had 25 inches, close to 25 inches of rainfall with slightly over 40 inches of potential evapotranspiration. So the gap between the actual rain and the potential evapotranspiration was narrow. That would create shallow groundwater depths and saturated topsoils, but there would also be increased water to force or push excess salts and sodium and other contaminants. So under dry weather, under wet weather, there would be more leaching. Now a wider gap, such as say in 2017, when we went from 25 inches of rainfall in 2016 to slightly over 10 inches of actual rainfall from April 1st to October 31st, there's not enough free gravitational water. So then the capillary water, which is the groundwater wicking up towards the topsoil, that comes into play. And that again brings salts and sodium and other contaminants. Our groundwater depths are lower, but this capillary water wicks up. So under wet weather, there was more leaching, but under dry weather, there was more wicking up. So this is the ratio between, or the gap between actual rainfall potential. It has different kind of effects in terms of groundwater movement and salt and sodium and other contaminant movement. If we want to talk about the wet and dry weather on soil health, or the salinity and sodicity, we'll need to understand what type of soil water are there and how they move. The first type of soil water is free gravitational water. This is the excess water. So when it rains, soils will hold some water, plant roots will absorb some water. And this is not the plant available water. The remaining water, after whatever soils will hold or plant roots will absorb, the remaining water, which is not the plant available water, is free excess water. And it moves with gravitational forces, so it's always want to go downwards into the soils, and it is held by macropores. And macropores mostly will be in light textured soils such as sandy or silt, and that's why they have much faster infiltration, which results in faster drainage compared to, say, heavier textured soils or the clay soils. And under good soil water infiltration and permeability, it'll move faster. But if the soil water infiltration and permeability are poor, and soils are not able to soak the water or infiltrate the water, then there would be runoff, surface runoff, and it'll create saturated soil condition, which will result in plant wilting. The second type of soil water is the plant available water, and it mostly occupy the micropores. So that means this type of water would be more prominent in heavier textured soils such as clay. Since this water moves against the forces of gravity, it can move in any direction. The principle which moves it is from wet to dry area. And the forces which move it are the forces of adhesion and cohesion. So adhesion is the attraction of water molecules for soil particles such as clay and humus, which have negative charges. That is not the force which is provided by silt and sand particles because they don't have any charges. These negative charges attract the positive or the hydrogen side of the water molecules, and cohesion is the attraction of water molecules for each other. Smaller is the size of the soil pores, which will be the case in terms of clay soils. More stronger would be these forces. So that means clay soils will have a lot of capillary water movement or the wicking up compared to, say, sand or silty soils. The third type of soil water is not really a big player when it comes to moving salts or sodium or becoming available to plants. It's called hydroscopic water. It's not even present in soil pores. It is very tightly held on the surfaces of soil particles as thin films. This one is not really a big player when it comes to moving the contaminant salts or becoming available to plants. If you look at the gravitational water or the free access water, the way it moves under wet weather, there would be a lot of gravitational water, so it can lead to shallow groundwater depths, and that would mean unhealthy growth environment for plants and the microbes due to saturated soil conditions. So there would be lack of oxygen here. There would be more water in the soil pores compared to oxygen. There would not be a healthy ratio between air and water. But if we have good infiltration, permeability, and the drainage, which is the byproduct of good infiltration and permeability, this water can actually leach or force excess salt, sodium, and other contaminants into the deeper depths of the soils where plant roots are not really hurt. And that would create a healthy growing environment for plants, microbes. Under dry weather, there will not be enough free gravitational water movement, so it cannot really push the excess salts and sodium and other contaminants into the deeper depths of the soil. Now, if we look at the capillary water movement under wet weather, this is not a big player because the gravitational water is the big player under wet weather. And its movement towards the topsoil or the wicking up or the rise would be restricted because it moves from wet to dry area, and there would be plenty of soil moisture in the topsoil. So it would not be the main cause of salinity and sodicity. The conditions under which this capillary water actually thrives are the drier conditions, because now there is not enough gravitational water, so not a lot of force to push these salts and sodium into the deeper depths, and the topsoil will have lack of moisture, dry topsoil, and this movement, this type of water movement becomes very prominent, and it will be the main cause of salinity and sodicity in the topsoil. Here's a diagram which gives us a rough idea how high the capillary water can rise in the soil. So say if our groundwater depth or water table is around 8.5 feet below the surface. If we have sandy soils, which will have macropores, sand particles do not have the negative charges, which will provide the forces of adhesion, this capillary water can roughly, say, rise around 2 feet, 2.5 feet. And that rise will be due to the clay or the humus particles. Now, if we have silty loam, there would be more clay and more, say, humus. The rise could be as high as, say, 4 or 5 feet. But if we have heavy clays with very high organic matter level, this groundwater can rise 8.5 feet from the groundwater depth to the topsoil. The challenges we can face in terms of soil health under wet weather are that our topsoils would be saturated. That means way more water than air. Plant roots will not have enough air to respire. That would create unhealthy growing environment for plants and microbes. it will lead to shallow groundwater depths. And our groundwater has high levels of salts and sodium and magnesium. So when excess salts will come, there would be a salinity issue. When excess sodium and magnesium will come, the ratio between the calcium and sodium and magnesium will become imbalanced. In a soil where we do not want any dense soil layers due to dispersion caused by sodicity or excessive swelling caused by higher magnesium levels versus calcium, we want calcium levels roughly 2.5 to 3 times more than magnesium and 4, 5, 6 times more than sodium. So that ratio will be disrupted, and because of sodicity or excessive swelling, the soil layers would be dense. They cannot infiltrate or soak up the water good. There would be runoff. We'll lose topsoil. That topsoil or the soil sediments will go into the ditches and that will contaminate our surface water resources. From a farming point of view, we'll have cooler and wet soils, resulting in delayed planting. And sometimes when we push tillage on wet soils, it'll lead to more compaction. Now, if you look at the challenges under dry weather, the outcomes may be the same, but the causes will be different. So instead of now wet and saturated topsoil, now we have lack of soil moisture for seed germination, plant and microbial growth. Now we'll have more air than water. Under wet weather, it was more water and then air. So again, the ratio would be not balanced. And then instead of having shallow groundwater depths because of a lot of gravitational water, now we'll have more lower groundwater depths because the weather would be dry. So the groundwater depths would be lower, but that would dry out the topsoil and that would result in increased wicking up of soil water or the capillary rise. And this is the groundwater which is wicking up. So there would still be a rise in salts and sodium and magnesium levels versus calcium. We'll still lose topsoil, but instead of runoff now, blowing would be the main source of soil erosion. And it will be maximized if we did a lot of tillage and rolling as well. And these soil sediments, again, will contaminate the surface water resources. So here's a picture of topsoil blowing away from last spring. Oftentimes the perception is that topsoil or the soil sediments don't go that far, but the finer soil particles can go hundreds of miles away. Here's a picture of eroded hilltops, again from last spring, along Highway 32 in the northern part of the Grand Forks County. Now I want to emphasize this is not the doing of just last year. Things probably have happened here during the past several years, but this is the effect I saw last spring. And this is again a headland which I've been observing since past 4 or 5 years. It's not just doing of the last year's dry weather during the early growing season, but if you already have a problem, this kind of a dry weather can make it worse. And the result is we will lose our investments. Now, practices which will help us not only maintain soil health, in some cases actually improve it too, and increase crop yields under wet weather, are that we should try to keep the living root growing by, say, planting a cover crop that not only uses excess water but can survive winter, and then we could plant green. So there's always a living root which is using up that excess water. If we cannot plant a cover crop timely, I think volunteer plants are a great resource to use the excess water and to cover the soils and to prevent the loss of topsoil, contamination of surface water resources. And we should also focus on improving soil water infiltration and permeability. I cannot emphasize more about these two soil properties. We often talk about improving soil drainage, which is the end result of good soil water infiltration and permeability, and improving, lowering the groundwater depths. But if we do not have good soil water infiltration or permeability, we cannot lower the groundwater depths despite tilings, and we cannot improve soil drainage. So permeability is the ability of a soil to transmit air and water. Water infiltration is the ability of a soil to allow water movement through the soil profile. And if we want to improve these two soil properties, we'll have to promote chemical aggregation of soil particle and biological aggregation of soil particle. Chemical aggregation will happen when we raise calcium levels versus sodium and magnesium when they are lower, and that will happen in unproductive areas. Good areas will always have higher calcium levels versus sodium and magnesium. And if we want to increase biological aggregation of soil particle, we'll try to do things which will help us increase organic matter. And yes, we also need to lower groundwater depth. But in order to do that, again, we'll have to start from improving soil water infiltration and permeability. And it's also essential to sample and test unproductive areas for salinity and acidity, because those areas will have poor soil water infiltration and permeability in case of acidity or higher magnesium levels versus calcium. Salts do not affect soils. They compete with plant roots for water. But if we have acidity or higher magnesium levels, we should take care of those issues. Here's a picture of a volunteer wheat crop growing close to Jamestown on November 4th. Beautiful crop. I would say one thing, that if I'm planning to plant a cover crop mix, instead of planting a mix which is very fancy, 9-10 species, expensive, if I cannot plant it early, instead of planting that, I would plant a simple mix, 2-3 species, or even I would rely on volunteers and let them grow. Giving volunteers or cover crop mix more time to grow is more beneficial than planting an expensive mix 3-4 weeks later. I would actually, this was a beautiful volunteer growth, and I would also say that last year, even though we were a little bit drier during the early part of the growing season, but then it started getting wet, which created harvest issues. There was a lot of shattering, so there was a lot of free seed which went into the soil. That's why we have this lush green volunteer stand. I would let these plants grow for as long as we can, unless these plants are going to seed and there could be a weed issue next year. Otherwise, I'll just let them grow. And during the winter, this residue can break down, and next year will not have any issues, as well as this residue or biomass ultimately will become part of the soil organic matter. And sampling and testing. We cannot leave these unproductive areas bare. And if we leave them bare, there would be more evaporation, more wicking up of groundwater, bringing more salts and sodium. We have to sample and test, and we have to plant something which will grow there to reduce the evaporation, at least to minimize the wicking up of groundwater. I mentioned improving soil water infiltration and permeability. This is the key for getting good soil drainage. So these pictures are from our tiling project site in Langdon. Soil acidity breaks down soil aggregates, and the term for that is soil dispersion. And that makes soil layers tight, shrinks the pore space, and slows down soil water infiltration. On this project site, we have different plots with varying levels of acidity. So in the picture on the right-hand side, we have higher levels of acidity. That means much slower soil water infiltration compared to the picture on the left. where there's no standing water right at the surface, and there's a standing water on the right hand side. And I took these pictures minutes apart on September 13, 2019. So you could see that there's standing water right at the surface in that area. So you would think that the tiling pump should run. So I went and I looked at the pump, and pump was not running. So you could see a main drain draining the water in the sump pump area, and the pump runs automatically. When the water level gets slightly higher than the bottom of the main drain, pump kicks in. So you saw that there was a standing water on one of the areas where the sodicity levels were high and the soil water infiltration was poor, but the pump was not running because despite the standing water, the soil was not infiltrating the water. So if we don't improve infiltration or permeability, we are not going to get good drainage despite the field being tiled. Now, if you look at the practices which will maintain soil health and increase crop yields under dry weather, number one thing is to avoid tillage unless it's absolutely necessary. Even if, say, we are not that worried about soil health, last spring, if I remember, we all were worried about having enough moisture in the seed bed for the seed to germinate. If the people who avoided tillage and just planted no-till, they had a little bit more moisture for seed germination compared to people who tilled. And some people I saw actually not only they tilled, but then they waited, and they can have their reasons, but 4 or 5 days they came back later and then planted the seed. So whatever moisture was there was mostly gone. Then the seed was sitting in the dry soil. Leave as much crop as stubble or residue as possible, because that will help us catch more snow, reduce evaporation, and retain more soil water. I've actually had some talks with some of you recently, and I was told that, say, the taller was a stubble, in one case, say canola stubble compared to, say, a soybean field. That canola stubble caught more snow, it reduced evaporation, retained more water, and there was much quicker seed germination, and the yields were much higher compared to, say, soybean field, which was planted no-till, but it didn't have a lot of residue. So that will help. And then if it is too late or costly to plant a cover crop after harvest, we should just let the volunteers grow. The volunteers are our free cover crops, and we should not underestimate the benefits of volunteers. Again, I would like to emphasize that if they are going to seed, those plants are going to seed, and we have a concern for weeds for next year, we could desiccate them. But I would avoid tillage. I would kill the volunteers by spraying, then tilling them. And plant no-till as much as possible and avoid rolling. If ever there was a year for no-till, I think it was 2021 spring, because we didn't have enough water. There was no concern about wet and cool soils. And then focus on improving soil water infiltration, permeability, and water holding capacity. These are the keys in order to get to the end result of improving soil drainage. And we could do that by promoting chemical aggregation of soil particles. And that would mean having 2.5 to 3 times more calcium than magnesium, and 4, 5, 6 times higher calcium levels than, say, sodium. And unproductive areas actually will have that kind of an issue, so we should sample and test those areas. And try to promote biological aggregation of soil particles, and that would mean increasing soil organic. Here's a very interesting picture. NDSU had a land judging contest last year on the lands of Forest River Colony, and you could see there is a very black layer which is buried under 2.5 feet of soil, and this is the buried A horizon, and they just stumbled upon it. So Dr. Dave Frenzen, he took a sample from that black layer and he got it analyzed for organic matter, and it came out as 5.9%, whereas the current topsoil has 2 to 2.5% organic matter. So what I'm trying to convey, that 2 to 2.5% is good, but there's a lot of room for improvement. And there are lots of theories out there that the organic matter levels were much higher compared to what we have today. And this is actually a small proof that, yes, I personally would think that the actual organic matter levels when people started farming these soils would be even higher than 5.9%. And the fastest way to increase organic matter is to add livestock manure. Now, I understand there could be some weed concern, there could be some disease concerns when it comes to crops like potatoes. I'm only strictly talking about spreading livestock manure in terms of soil health. And this is the fastest way we could increase soil organic matter. When we add livestock manure, microbes just thrive on that. Their population will explode, and so will be the diversity of the population, like the types of microbes. And when they die, they will become part of the organic matter. That's one way. Another way is the old-fashioned way. For example, green manure crop. People used to plant clovers, and when they would be 4 or 5 feet high, they used to turn them into the soil. That would be another way to increase organic matter. And in the picture on the right-hand side, there's a cover crop. The growth was a little bit over 2 feet. And the reason we got this fabulous growth, because it was planted around the end of July, so it got a little bit more time to grow. And that's what I was emphasizing earlier. We need to give. This was a simple mix, 3 species, chickling vetch, forage barley, and turnips. And it grew fabulous to a level where farmers were actually concerned whether this residue will break down during the next spring or no. So what he did, he chopped it up, and next year, so this was 2017, in 2018 he planted canola crop there, and according to his own words, he never had a better canola crop than what he had in 2018 on the field where this cover crop grew in 2017. So if I have to summarize all of the practices we discussed, so we discussed the practices which will work in wet years, and then what will work in dry years to improve soil health. These are some of the practices which will actually work under wet as well as dry years. Number 1, avoid tillage unless it's necessary, and I will let the producers decide what is necessary, what is not necessary. Cover the topsoil for as long as possible. Sample and test the unproductive areas for salinity, sodicity, and high magnesium levels versus calcium. Treat the unproductive areas differently, because whatever we have been doing so far is not working, and we are losing money in terms of planting annual crops, which are not only not growing, so we are losing money, but they're not helping the land. And we should plant something which is suitable based on these soil results, whether it's a salt-tolerant annual crop or perennial salt-tolerant grasses. Maintain and try to increase organic matter. We already discussed spread livestock manure, plant cover crops which can grow for a longer period of time, and focus on improving soil water infiltration and permeability. We often talk about soil drainage, but improving soil drainage is the end product. And in order to get there, these are the soil properties we need to work on: improving soil water infiltration and permeability. With that, I would like to thank everyone who would be listening to this presentation. And if there are any questions, you could reach out to me at the Langdon Research Extension Center, or reach out to Ramsey and Benson County Extension offices. Thank you.